epics that were written in later antiquity upon the dawning of Christianity and into Byzantium, these are experiencing a huge amount of intellectual energy.
Welcome to Lesky, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. What do you think of when you think of ancient epic? Homer and Virgil are probably the names that spring to mind, and on the Greek side, maybe also Apollonius of Rhodes, maybe even Hesiod. There was, though, an enormous amount of poetic production in antiquity that could, quite reasonably, be thought of under the rubric of epic. From Appian's Halieutica to Caluthus's Abduction of Helen, from the Homeric hymns to Nonnus's Dionysiaca and beyond, there is a whole mass of surviving poetry that deserves to be considered, in one way or another, as part of the ancient Greek epic tradition. My two guests for this episode have both done a huge amount of work to expand how the discipline of classics conceives of and approaches the corpus of ancient Greek epic. This episode is occasioned by the recent publication of the Cambridge Companion to Ancient Greek Epic, which was beautifully edited by one of those guests, Emma Greensmith. As part of the apparatus of Emma's volume, there's a timeline of ancient Greek epic that stretches well over a millennium, from Iron Age Greece to the very end of the Western Roman Empire. And it's a timeline to which the individual contributions, taken together, do justice, in the author's combined efforts to take this entire range of work seriously as instances of the ancient Greek epic tradition. Emma Greensmith is Associate Professor of Classical Languages and Literature at the University of Oxford and Fellow of St. John's College. She is the editor of Omnibus and an associate editor for the Yearbook of Ancient Greek Epic. She specializes in Imperial Greek literature, particularly epic poetics and religious culture. Her 2020 book, The Resurrection of Homer in Imperial Greek Epic, offers a new reading of the role of epic and the reception of Homer in the Greco-Roman world. She's written many articles on ancient Greek literature and has co-edited a volume on Writing Homer under Rome from 2022. She works on several public engagement initiatives with the charity Classics for All, and recently filmed a documentary on Homer's Odyssey and its cultural legacy. Tim Whitmarsh, a Fellow of the British Academy, is Regius Professor of Greek at the University of Cambridge and Fellow of Trinity College. A specialist in the literature, culture, and religion of ancient Greece, Tim is the author of 10 books, including Battling the Gods, Atheism in the Ancient World from 2015, and over 100 academic articles. He has contributed to newspapers such as The Guardian, the Times Literary Supplement, and the London Review of Books, as well as to BBC Radio and TV. Just a quick note that, as ever, I've put a few references in the show notes for this episode. So now I'd like to welcome into the Lesky Emma Greensmith and Tim Whitmarsh. The next voice you'll be hearing is Emma's.
Greek epic is having something of a cultural moment, which doesn't seem to be constricted to one particular little zeitgeist. It seems to be here to stay. There's so much going on in the popular sphere and in the important sphere that connects academia to a public audience. The huge outpouring of feminist retellings of Greek mythology, a lot of which have epic in the epic cycle at their centre. Big and small screen ventures. Epic seems to be really speaking to non-academic audiences right now and still has a huge resonance and relevance in the academic world as well, both enduring interest in applying new perspectives to Homer and Hesiod and the cycle, but also what was at one point considered marginal, non-canonical, sub-canonical, whatever terms we want to use, epics that were written in later antiquity upon the dawning of Christianity and into Byzantium. These are experiencing a huge amount of intellectual energy. So partly drawing on my own experience as someone who cut my teeth academically working on post-classical Greek epic, but was brought up at university on a diet of Homer and co. I thought it would be a great moment for me personally to work backwards and forwards from my first publications, which were on this later type of epic, but also think kind of joined up way about the earliest iterations of the Greek epic tradition with its later and very much ongoing relevance.
Well, I think this is a question really, for both of you in a way, but I'm just wondering to what extent you think that just the word itself, epic, maybe conjures a different image, a set of material in the mind of classicists in particular nowadays than maybe it did a few decades ago. Do you think that, or would you like the word to mean something a little bit different than maybe it meant when it was just really Homer that we would think of, or maybe Apollonius? I mean, to what extent do you perceive that shift is happening, and to what extent do you think it still has some desirable location to reach?
Well, actually, one of the things I did is both academic and also market research at the very early iterations of this volume. It didn't actually make it into the prose, but very much informed the thinking was I sent an email out to a load of my colleagues, my ancient literature colleagues and ancient history colleagues at Oxford and more widely, but also a lot of my friends that I'd met in various people I've worked with on public engagement initiatives, the crew that I filmed a documentary on the Odyssey with, and I asked, and a lot of students, current and former students, and I asked them a bit like a word association, what right now does epic mean to you? And the answers were extremely interesting, both in a non-purely academic dimension, but speaking particularly to your question, what a lot of the academics said was very interesting. There were still some that almost anticipating of a resistance to my question was still very much like, well, epic fundamentally almost ab initio means Homer and Hesiod, and then we can talk about epic versus the reception of epic. But I think other answers did very much speak to the fact that it's any text, and text that can be used very broadly, that has the genre of epic at its core. So yes, both in terms of the epics that were written in active imitation of Homer, in a time and space that could not be more different from the original context, whatever we think that means, that the Homeric epics were written, but also more broadly the idea of texts that have epic resonance that don't necessarily have any direct connection or any direct imitation of what we might think of the structural hallmarks like meter or even stuff like length. So I think it was interesting to see both a desire in some senses to cling on to something fundamental and in some senses restrictive, associating epic squiggly line equals Homer, but also the answers that are very much not necessarily just pushing back against that, but are thinking beyond that as well.
Yeah, because, your table of contents, it just has, you can see just from that glance that you go from Homer, the volume covers, from Homer all the way to the 6th century CE with the Coleuthus' abduction of Helen. So it strikes me that in one sense, one of the things that this volume is, seeking to do, and I'm sure accomplishing, is moving those later authors out of the Epilian and epic reception buckets into just epic writ large as a category. And Tim, I'm wondering, because, you were the principal investigator of the Greek Epic of the Roman Empire Cultural History Project. What have you seen in the last few years in terms of this kind of redefinition of some sort of general understanding of epic? And to what extent was that something that was fueling the project, which you both were members of?
I mean, I guess epic in the narrative form, because we have to remember there's also didactic epic, which is something else, but epic in the narrative form is a kind of time machine, isn't it? And it always is that. It always reaches back into the distant past and asks us to think about foundations, origins, deep regress, if you like, cultural regress. But at the same time, epic is always part of a tradition, and it always envisages the future as well. So there's a very strange vertiginous effect when you read. I mean, even already in Homer, you get the sense that this is material that has been worked over for hundreds, possibly even more than a millennium, hundreds of years. So you always get the sense that it's on the one hand sort of looking backwards, but on the other hand, I mean, the Homeric texts are at the anchor. They're the anchor point for a later tradition, and they change significance as they move through time. I mean, people reading Homer in the Hellenistic period are doing something very different to what people were doing in the 8th century when they were listening to Homer. And again, that's different in the Imperial period as well. Homer becomes a sort of a cultural reference point for a deep past that reaches back beyond the classical period. In the Imperial period, they're obsessed with the classical period. They're obsessed with prose. They're obsessed with rhetoric. But epic somehow reaches back to a sort of primordial time before the classical period. So, as I say, one of the things that you get when you look at the later period is a sense of a sort of destabilizing sense of the temporality of epic and the position that it adopts vis-a-vis temporality. It's not a straightforwardly historical mode. It's not something that says, 1500 years ago, these events happened or whatever, and here are the events. It is something that is it reaches for the sublime, and the sublime means breaking of categories and breaking of linear modes of measurement. So in the Imperial period, you also get fantasies of proximity, where there's Philostratus' Heroikos, for example, is a famous prose text that envisages a character who converses with the ghosts of Homeric heroes. So you get this sort of squashing up of time where the deep past suddenly blasts its way into the present. All of these temporal games that you get come out through looking at epic over the long period and thinking about how it, as I say, diachronically develops, but also collapses that diachronic moment in the experiential reading of text.
Yeah, I think that one of the really exciting things about this volume is the way that temporality really lies at the core of it. And in a way, it seems to be almost a center around so much crystallizes. Emma, you decided to divide up the volumes thematically, which is something that I'd like to come back to. But really kind of at the center of it is this theme of temporality. And that's the question that you address in your chapter. And I was wondering if you could perhaps just add to that and speak a little bit to why this theme of temporality is both so important to what subsequent epicists were doing or experimenting with, and then, also to your construction of the volume. I mean, I was really taken by your chapter on Quintus of Smyrna, on Tryphiodorus, and on Caluthus, and the way that you start with picking up on Goldhill's chapter, also where he lays out these 3 core aspects of epic temporality. But then you depart from that really incredible moment in Iliad 6 when Hector and Andromache are talking at the Scaean Gates, and Hector says there will be a day that Troy falls, and sort of use that as a launch pad to examine some of the temporal thematics that Tim was alluding to. So could you maybe just tell us a little bit more about what your chapter is doing with temporalities, the authors that you chose, and how the temporality is projected as almost a architectural concept in the volume itself?
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. That is an overarching thread that connects so many of the chapters and so many of the themes. And I think in terms of name a piece of literature or a text or a work of art that doesn't speak to time of some sort. But I think one of the things of thinking temporally with epic, or thinking about how epic thinks temporally, is that it does it in a way very silently, and particularly the texts that I look at, the way in which they can be situated and that they situate themselves. Tim talked about how things can make a claim. You can make a claim to epic, and it's through Homer. And these texts do it literally through Homer. Self-gesturing, there's no self-naming, there's no proof this were a Latin volume, there's no anachronism of the underworld, there's a space for futuricity, and Aeneas wearing his Augustan future on his breast and not realizing it. There's none of that. They keep very silent about their cultural context. And I think that's really productive, in that I think it really helps, resist some urges of trying to contextualize by a paint by numbers way. This isn't about decoding silence in a way. It's about, as trite as it sounds, letting the silence speak, and their claims to what it is they're doing and who it is they are as literary agents is through, Jim talked about the obsessive reach for the deep past that we see in texts like Philostratus. But it's through embodying that deep past. And that's something that the trio of authors that I looked at in my chapter have always deeply I've always been deeply fascinated by is how they don't just talk about Homer. They are him. They embody him. And that's formalistic as well. They embody his form. They speak, they sing with his voice. They use his meter. And that is at the knowing expense of any self-posturing. So I think that temporality is a way of unsettling, historicizing thinking that can sometimes be quite dominant in how I read text and also in how we teach text as well. And I think that in itself is really productively destabilizing, which is why I love these texts. I take off from that moment in Iliad 6, but that's also by going into the space that these texts are. They are back in Troy and giving what was going on in, say, they're from the 3rd to the 5th centuries CE. That immersion back into that timescape is very intense. And I think is very beautiful. And I think it's a really interesting reading experience to engage with them on those terms, which is what I've tried to do. And yes, in various ways as well, the way in which the chapters try to get back into that timescape of epic, because Greek epic's timescape, I think, is something that is really distinctive to it.
For those whose memories might need some refreshing, do you mind just reminding everyone about who this triad that you're dealing with was? So Quintus of Smyrna, Tryphiodorus, and Caluthus. Do you mind just a quick reprimer in their works?
Yeah, reprimer. Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned earlier that the epic cycle, which are the texts that cover parts of the Trojan saga that aren't in the primary narratives of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the epic cycle itself, which was composed still in the archaic period, broadly speaking, most of that doesn't survive. It only survives in fragments and summaries. But what we do have in the imperial period, which is part of the narrative tradition, as Tim mentioned, of poetry, which are it's certainly continued rigorously. We have Apollonius as our main Hellenistic epic, but we also know there is so much more Hellenistic epic that doesn't survive. But it either continued or it came back with a sort of a vengeance in the imperial period, it being a narrative subject matter which covered precisely that material of the epic cycle. So the Trojan saga. So what Quintus of Smyrna's Post-Homerica does, the title, the Post-Homerica, is a bit misleading. It actually narrates the story from the minute or moment the Iliad finishes. So its first line, it's unique in the epic tradition. Its first word is when, and it's when the funeral of Hector had finished and the fire was still burning.
Could I just say very quickly that upon reading your chapter, it was extraordinary because I had just been working on some Thucydides and Xenophon, and it's just so reminiscent in a way of the way the Hellenica picks up the Thucydides with the meta de tauta, and it just that way of creating this almost this Carmen Perpetuum that in this case in the epic tradition, I just thought you brought that out beautifully.
Yeah, and it's without taking a breath. It varies Xenophon in a way. I think in a way, much more work should be done actually on Quintus and historiography in that way. I think that's a really important double act that hasn't been done, but that can be another volume. But yes, if it tells the story that picking up in that Xenophonic way in that moment after the Iliad, and it finishes, it tells the whole story. So the death of Achilles, the getting back of Philoctetes, the death of Paris, the arrivals and deaths of Trojan allies like Penthesilea and Memnon. And then it takes us all the way through to the sack of Troy, and then it finishes with the storm kickstarted by Athena that instigates the plot of the Odyssey. So it really is the poem of the Homeric interval in that way. And then Tryphiodorus you mentioned this word, Pilion, which from a formalistic perspective is a bit of a contradiction in terms. It's a miniature epic, which Berenice's chapter, I think, does fantastically. And it tells in fewer lines than most books of Homer, the sack of Troy. And it's got a real aesthetics of speediness. Tryphiodorus starts by telling the muse to sing with haste, to hurry up. And it does the sack of Troy in an extremely compressed and rapid way. Caluthus, who wrote in the 6th century CE, he goes back in time, still in this Trojan saga, and he talks about the origins, and he's very into premodality. He talks about the origins of the Trojan War, namely the apple contest, the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, and Paris's trip to capture Helen. And it ends, Caluthus ends, he's also an Opilian, he ends with this incredible moment witnessed by Cassandra and the Trojans of Helen coming into Troy. So it ends with the beginning in that sense. So they're an incredible triad of not only from a homocentric perspective, filling the gaps and maybe also filling the gaps because the epic cycle wasn't in circulation, but more than that, of actually really providing a space-time, Tim talked about time machine, a space-time map of this really foundational mythology that so much else deals with in a much more sort of distant way.
Well, can I just ask you, you mentioned the epic cycle again. And, one thing that I was wondering is the spread of themes that these authors cover, from Caleuthus redoing elements of the Cypria with his abduction of Helen. And then you have Quintus redoing the Aethiopus and the Little Iliad. And then you have Triviodorus doing the sack of Troy. But they're not overlapping with the Homeric material. They out of that, like tragedy did. I mean, to what extent do you think then they're damping out those previous epic cycle poems by Lesky's and whoever, these other ones that we hear about through various testimonia? Do they perceive a weakness in the tradition that they are then going in to fill? Or is this a sort of, no, it didn't happen that way?
Yeah, and it's really great that you mentioned tragedy there as well, because, one way of thinking about why, and these are three, I call them a trio, but there are lots and lots of epics from this time, which is something that the project that you mentioned before, that Tim led and that I was working on, tried to collate all of this material that we have from the imperial period. And there is tons of it, both fragmentary and more or less fully surviving, that seems to do stuff with Troy. And one way of thinking about it is a corrective reading, a revisionist reading, a stamping on or stamping out. And, that's certainly a possibility. It's a possibility historically in that if as some theories might have it, the epic cycle had fallen out of circulation by the 3rd century, then there's a real gap in the market, quite literally, for new epics covering this material. Yes, it could also be not only showing what Homer didn't say, but also, in a sense, what Homer got wrong, emphases he didn't put, and so forth. Quintus talks about Palamedes, who by this era has the hero that Homer famously ignored. He doesn't treat Palamedes, who should have been so important, and of course Philoctetes, who had become a hero of tragedy but had no real epic representation, and could be read as glibly dealt with in the Iliad. He's just a little cross-reference in the catalogue. And I think that certainly is a reading, again, about why I think some of this epic is so brilliant, in that it produces a really productive resistance to, I think, ways of reading that have, for whatever reason, become quite entrenched, certainly in me. The more time I've spent with them, the more I don't think that's what they're doing. It's partly this sort of silence. Triviodorus is, I'd recommend everyone read it. It's a quick read, literally. It's a brilliant read. He's in a rush, but you don't get, I don't know what you think, Tim, I don't get an agonism from them. I don't get an antagonism or a pushback. I feel that they are doing something that is quite free and quite independent. Right? And part of that is because this is so knowingly not new. And that's partly why epic has always fascinated me. This isn't carving out new ground. It's not being genre bending or defiant in any of the ways that sometimes we think about literary innovation. It's not Bloomian. It's not killing anybody. It's not sort of Eliot style, when bad poets deface, good poets make stuff into something better. It's returning to material that everybody already knows. And if you choose to do that, this is very much a choice, then there's almost a freedom that comes with not having to explain why, because letting the material and letting the return to this stuff speak for itself. So I think part of the challenge, bringing this stuff, as you say, out of the hinterland and really integrating it into what we think about the world of epic should be, is actually finding a way of talking about what they're doing. And I think that quite a lot of the models we have for stuff like Virgil, and even for stuff like Homer and Hesiod, and that contest model, the Curtiman, doesn't work for them. And I think it's still part of an ongoing conversation about, I think we're getting somewhere about what they're not doing, but how we can characterize what it is they are doing, I think is still something that's quite an active part of what's so exciting about thinking about these texts.
No, that's great. I think it's fun to think about them as opening up the material even more rather than standing in some sort of antagonistic position.
Can I jump in there?
Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, because Emma invited me to think about this question of how agonistic late epic is with its past. And I think that what she said is absolutely right for the authors she was dealing with. But there are, of course, other epics which have a different relationship to the Homeric and Hesiodic past. Nonnus, for example, we haven't mentioned Nonnus yet, although he wrote the longest surviving epic from antiquity, 48 books of Dionysiaca, of the adventures of Dionysus. Nonnus explicitly says in one of his poems that he's vying, eridzane, I think is the verb that he uses, with both old and new. So he's competing with his contemporaries, but also competing with Father Homer. And he explicitly invokes this sort of Oedipal idea of the relationship between the son and the father. Now, Nonnus is a special case in so many ways. I mean, he really is a one-off, and another. You can't race through Nonnus in the way that you can through Tryphiodorus. It takes an awful long time, and it's difficult Greek or whatever. But everyone should read Nonnus once in their life. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary, zany stuff. There is a whole other body of late Greek epic that places itself in a interestingly differently contestatory relationship to the past, which is the Christian epics. And we get our earliest Christian epic is probably 4th century. It's the Vision of Dorotheus, which is, again, a really extraordinary text, which survives probably from a monastic library in Egypt. It survives as part of a codex, one of the earliest surviving, largely intact codices that we have. So interesting as a physical artifact as well. But then by the time we get into the 5th century, which is, I haven't done the sums here, but I imagine the 5th century CE is the century from antiquity from which we have the most epic written, paradoxically. I mean, there's just a huge amount of stuff there. But a lot of it is Christian material. And in particular, it's this genre of using Greek, traditional Greek forms like Homeric formulae, obviously the hexameter meter, traditional Greek lexis and so forth, but repurposing it for a Christian context. And most dramatically in the form of the Cento, of course, where Eudokia writes this Cento, taking Homeric lines and Homeric phrases and reordering them so as to tell biblical stories, particularly Christian, but also some Hebrew Bible stories there as well. So, I mean, that's such a agonistic way of relating to the past. What you're doing, in effect, with a Cento is saying that we are going to eviscerate the content from traditional epic and keep only the form. And we do see Christians speaking in exactly these sort of terms about how they admire the form of the classical past, but they don't admire the content. So they're going to gut the content and use the form to tell entirely new stories. So there is there's a whole body of material there that is doing something really interestingly innovative. And the question is, why are they still addicted to epic? Why don't they just create a new form? I mean, sometimes people did. I mean, in Romanus the Melodist, for example, creates the new form of the verse hymn, which is, the origin of the modern Christian hymn. So they can do it, but for some reason, lots of people don't do that. They decide to stick to Greek epic as the paradigm of the most authoritative, perhaps even the most religiously rich form of traditional Greek literature.
Rereading some of the introduction I wrote recently, words like strange, unexpected, uncanny, unusual, destabilizing come up so much. And I think the late material really crystallizes this. But of course, it's always already true all the way back in Homer. And I think but another thing that, in terms of going back to the first question, like why do epic now, is bringing out some of the really strange properties of this genre. Because yes, it can't just be about the cachet of epic, the most sort of foundational genre, highbrow. Yes, it is. But when you see how it's used, where we end up, it doesn't feel, people have struggled with this with the Cento a lot. Is it parody? Is it perversion? Or is there something actually really quite serious about this? But whatever categorization we end up at, there is something very, very radical going on with the epic form all the way through, which you might expect for stuff like the novel, but you don't tend to expect for a genre that seems so secure and seems so stable as epic. So I think that's been something really fun working it all the way through. And as you say, Tim, the Christian material, it really brings this out.
Well, Emma, I think you put it really beautifully in the introduction, actually, when you're outlining the framework of the volume. And in you say, and this is just really on the first pages of it, I'll just read this briefly if you don't mind. That you write that on the one hand, the quiddity of Greek epic is readily definable. It can be described through the connected matrix of the terms epos in its most basic sense word, aoide, song, and muthos, authoritative utterance. It's metrically marked by the dactylic hexameter. It's characterized by heroic themes and diction, or formal features such as length, recurring scenes, and motifs, and occupied a firmly central place in ancient Greek education and culture. And this is what I was really getting to. On the other hand, the poems within this seemingly stable literary edifice, from the epics of Homer to Nonnus and beyond, have threatened to burst their own dams, finding inventive, disorienting ways to resist constructed taxonomies. I love that image of threatening to burst their own dams. If I was understanding correctly, I mean, this is what you were getting at, is that, we think of epic as just such a formally rigid, in some ways, genre, but this, unbelievable experimentation that's coming, particularly as we move forward through time, I think really causes, or should invite us to rethink a lot about what we assume in terms of some of even the formal features, let alone the spirit of it. Tim, do you mind perhaps reminding our listeners about the Vision of Dorotheus, for those who haven't read it all too recently?
Yes, we always say that, don't we? I haven't really read it recently. Yeah. Well, the Vision of Dorotheus is a hexameter poem, 300 and something lines long, in the form that we have it. It's not entirely complete. As I say, it survives in a codex as part of what we call the Codex of Visions, which is a set of Christian texts from a monastery that seem to focus on the idea of divine epiphany, if you like. So we have the Shepherd of Hermas in there, which is a prose text, which deals with a guy called Hermas who has a series of visions and the like. It's got a few other very interesting hexameter texts in it. One is called What Would Cain Have Said When He Killed Abel? And the other, the paired one, is What Would Abel Have Said When He Was Killed by Cain? Which I love that title. So anyway, it's a collection, a really interesting ancient Christian poetic collection that we have. And as I say, it's usually said to date from the 4th century or so. Interestingly, it ties up with the Quintus question, the dating of Quintus, because at the end of the Vision of Dorotheus, there's a little subscriptio at the end that says that this is the vision, the horama, of Dorotheus, the son of Quintus the poet, or it could be Dorotheus the poet, son of Quintus, depending on how you put the different words together. So, it's possible that Dorotheus was the son of Quintus of Smyrna. People have argued that, but we don't know. I mean, obviously it's just a name. Anyway, okay, so what happens in the Vision of Dorotheus? Well, Dorotheus, I think it's comic text. I've struggled to read it in any other way.
Do you think the author would agree with you?
Well, I don't know.
Can I just come in and say I've just written an article on this text, and I don't think it's funny, but maybe my sense of humour is not as refined as Tim's, so...
Well, Dorotheus is a guard in the imperial palace, and he has a little snooze, and he's transported up to heaven. And heaven has exactly the structure of the imperial palace, with all of the bureaucratic features there, and all of the sort of Latinate names of officials and the like. And in heaven, Dorotheus is set to guard an entrance to the palace. And he gets a little bit bored, and he thinks, I better go and have I've got a rare opportunity to see what heaven's like. I'm going to go and have a nose around and see what heaven is like. And he gets into terrible trouble. And at one point, Jesus arraigns him and yells at him. As I say, I mean, it's not all hilariously funny, but it does have these moments of, I think, quiet humour in them. I mean, as I say, particularly with the relationship between the earthly kingdom and the heavenly kingdom, that dialectic between the two, I think is lots of fun. Anyway, so in the course of it, he's given a second chance, and he proves his worth, and then he's baptized, and it seems to be a sort of conversion thing, and then he has his name changed from Dorotheus to Andrew, to Andreos. So he becomes very manly, and he becomes sort of super butch and bulked up, and people look at him and they say, well, wow, he's incredibly big and strong. He looks as big and strong as Jesus, and that's where it ends up. So it's really about sort of Dorotheus's conversion via this dream vision of heaven. So yeah, do you want to know anything more about it? Any more jokes?
Yeah, I do want to know. So are we at this point, I mean, I know all these chronologies are tentative. Are we talking already about the Imperial Palace in Constantinople now, or does it matter?
Yeah, so it's not that there was no explicit location mentioned for the vision of Dorotheus. The dating of this text is based on the officials who are mentioned in the text, and it seems to be that they are 4th century officials. So some people have thought that it's the court of Diocletian that's being described, but perhaps in retrospect, as it were. So so it's probably a 4th century text, and I forget the details around the sort of the, if you like, the sort of the material object of the codex itself, and how we can date that. I'm sure that that can be dated within a relatively tight window as well. But yeah, I think 4th century is the dominant view at the moment.
But in terms of sorry to come in there, but one of the really interesting things that this text does, which works, I think, really well, and Tim talks about it in his chapter in this volume, I think, brilliantly. It's a really good sort of first encounter with it for people who are interested in it. There's also a very good edition and translation, which is quite readily available. But it, as well as content-wise being so far from the Trojan timescape that I talked about before with these epics that were also being composed at the same time, in terms of its formal feature, it is hexametric, as Tim said, and it uses a lot of Homer's language. Dorotheus uses nepios really interestingly in a way that I think is very pointed in terms of he uses it about himself. So suddenly nepios becomes like a sinner in the way that the Homeric narrator, Dorotheus is also the narrator as well as the main character, would only ever use it about characters in this bardic way. Dorotheus uses it about himself to describe his faults, his most sinful fault. But it also, and this is something that we don't have a huge amount of testimony for anywhere else, it code switches. So going back to your question about Constantinople, he has quite a lot of Latin loanwords, noted Latin words in there, which is very interesting as a on the ground. If we do take the monastic context seriously, so just a quick composition which shows the linguistic ability, for want of a better word, at large at the time. And it also has words of biblical koine in it. So it's quite lexically daring as well. It's hyper-Homeric, but it really does, if you take the 4th century context, which I'm quite convinced by, show the range of, I talked about epic bursting its downs, but it's really stretching epic to its limits in terms of what can be contained within it. You have fundamentally Homeric lexicon and suddenly words, not just the theme and the setting of a Roman palace, but also its language, the language of the Roman militia as well. Really.
And do you think, Emma, are you convinced by the allusion to Quintus? I can't remember what you say about that.
I think, plot spoiler. This article was hopefully coming out in Classical Antiquity reasonably soon. I think it's very poetic. I think that it's, and I think sort of my argument is that it's Dorotheus claiming that in the way that you said, Nonnus says, well, I'm going to vie with Father Homer. It's Dorotheus sort of thinking about Quintus as the model of traditional epic that he's now deviating from. Because this looks nothing like the little plot of the Post-Homerica that I gave, and indeed it's not, as a reading experience as well. And if I'm right, which of course I am, then what that also suggests, back to what you said, Johanna, about trying to think about this later epic as a central part of what we mean by epic. This is the later material, so this Christian monk in the 4th century, thinking about the author of this epic cycle replacement text, this Trojan mythological text, Quintus Post-Homerica, as a canonical predecessor that he is innovating from. So all the things that we are so used to talking about, what Ovid does to Virgil, the curtailment between Hesiod and Homer and so forth, we have an ecosystem of this same poetic dynamism potentially going on in these later authors that we as classicists just, I think, are really missing a huge number of tricks by only thinking about them as a postscript to the main epic story, because they're not thinking like that at all. They're thinking very much in an ongoing energy there.
I think that's a really crucial point to remember. That I think that's the one thing I'd really want to hammer home from my point of view is that by the time you get to the 5th and 6th centuries CE, Roman Greek literature is itself classic. People are looking back to this stuff and saying, these are my cultural reference points. These are the things I'm going to bounce off. I mean, perhaps the most important poetic writer of the 2nd century was Oppian, whose poem on fish and fishing. Emily Kneebone was also on our project, and she wrote a brilliant book on this, and a much recommended book. Oppian, I mean, it's such a non-obvious topic. Fish, why write an epic on fish? But it becomes such a classic, and it's referenced by people like Nonnus all the time. Nonnus gets an awful lot of his highly sophisticated, complex vocabulary and lexemes from Oppian, and his language of war as well, because the fish are always fighting with each other. So these late Greek epics, they're not just, beset by belatedness and obsessed by their relationship with the classical past. They are classics in their own right, and they become that very quickly afterwards.
Well, Tim, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your chapter, which touches so much on Christian epic. I mean, thinking back for Emma's, if there was a kind of slogan there resided in Hector's statement, or his sort of premonition or, prophecy almost that Troy will fall. I mean, for your chapter, what it seemed to be the animating question was, posed by Jerome, this, what is Virgil to do with the gospel? And then I was just wondering what you thought, because in the 2010 Cambridge Companion to Epic, just sort of more generally, that was edited by Catherine Bates, Jasper Griffin has the chapter on Greek epic. And in that, he writes that the victory of the new Christian religion was inimical to the creation of heroic epics. And I was wondering, Tim, how you would, I guess in a sense, I'm inviting you to discuss, in inverted commas, Jasper Griffin's remark there. I mean, how would you respond to that accounting of things?
Well, going back to the point I made earlier about the volume of material that we have from the 5th century, I mean, it's clear that, 5th century CE, that is, it's clear that Christianity, the advent of Christianity, does not discourage the writing of epic. Now, epic does fizzle out. We don't really have any epic after the 6th century. There's a 9th century poem, a hexameter poem on the Book of Job, but then you have to really wait for the medieval to get more sort of epic Renaissance stuff. So it does disappear in the 6th century, but something re-energizes epic in the 5th century, at least in terms of our surviving record. Now, it seems to me that there are two complementary modes going on here. One is, I mentioned earlier, that's the sort of Christianization. What Christians are doing is they're taking the most prestigious of Greek literary forms, traditional pagan Greek literary forms, gutting it of content and repurposing it as classical. And this is a very strong statement of what Christianity can now do. And it's authorized by a series of theological claims made in the late 4th century, particularly by Basil of Caesarea, who says you can read, despite what the Emperor Julian said, you as a Christian can read Greek literature. It's fine, but you have to do it in a very selective Christian way. You have to take what is Christian friendly about it and run with that and leave everything else behind. You've got to be like the honeybee landing on a flower and taking the pollen and leaving everything else behind. So there's that very sort of appropriative Christian mode. But there's another mode, which is the one that Nonnus' Dionysiaca goes down. And I think I would say Musaeus' Hero and Leander also goes down. That's another great poem which we haven't talked about. Caleuthus' Abduction of Helen, which Emma was talking about earlier. These kinds of poems are, I think, running with, if you like, the dirtiness of traditional Greek epic. They're creating a space in which Christians, who are now terribly restricted in terms of what they can do and what they can talk about, the world of pagan epic becomes a sort of a sandpit in which you can actually explore risque ideas like same-sex desire, like adultery, like abduction, even in the case of Caleuthus, whatever. So I think there's a sort of two-pronged aspect to the Christian world's reception of Greek epic.
And that in itself is, again, thinking about the always already paradoxical qualities of epic, because that in itself is already a very selective reading of traditional pagan epic, because in some ways it's not, is it? Epic, the plot of Homer. Yeah, we have Achilles and Patroclus, but of course that's never, it's never X-rated stuff. Epic isn't the genre. Stephen Smith's got a chapter in the companion on love, desire, and erotics. And he talks about philotes as a concept and eros. But to think about epic as the genre where you go to have your cake and eat it, what the martyrologies did in late antiquity with violence, the epic is the genre you go to have your erotic fix, is already transposing onto epic a particular reading. And I think you're right, Tim, that part of the reason for picking epic, and not even drama or historiography or so forth, has to be to do with the fact that on the one hand it's so highbrow. That's why I said that can't be the full answer, and it's not. It's highbrow, but therefore because it's highbrow it can also therefore become the risque alternative. It has both baked in.
Well, Emma, can I just ask you then a little bit more about some of your editorial thinking and decision making? This is such a, as I think this conversation has brought out, it's such a wide range of material. And really, I think even within the domain of classics and the world of classicists, it goes from, like you were saying, the thing that you're brought up on, Homer, right, to texts that are probably going to be unfamiliar to quite a lot of people, even within the field. So in creating a Cambridge Companion and in laying it out and designing the format of it, what were some of the things that you took into consideration as you were contemplating having to sort of reintroduce Homer at the same time that you were maybe introducing some of these more obscure, relatively speaking, of course, texts?
Yeah, and of course, fundamentally was the fact to have them all together side by side, well, not even side by side, to use the metaphor of sandpits, but them all playing together, them all smushed together. And, not only doing it thematically was something it wasn't a hard choice. It was very much what I wanted to do, not only because I think it's much more fun, but that in itself is sort of iconoclastic in any way. There are plenty of thematically organised volumes, but what the thematic structure enabled was creative juxtapositions or unusual juxtapositions. So chapters like Pauline Levan, who does affect, who does Homer, Apollonius, and Quintus. Stephen Smith chapter on erotics that I talked about before, does the Odyssey and Nonnus, and doing so for a purpose. So I think in a sense the method enabled the result, which was to show rather than tell, that texts like Quintus and Nonnus have as much to say about these themes as their more canonical predecessors. And I think one of the things that has always energized me as a scholar is to never apologize for these later texts. I think by now we're at a stage where we shouldn't forget we probably need to introduce them, as you say, but not to apologize for them, and that our reason for talking about them shouldn't be, hey guys, they exist, and everyone else has been so stupid not to think about them. Taking that as a given, even though it might not be, and actually showing that they're worth reading rather than just proclaiming that. And so putting them in dialogue with more familiar or still more popular text was a real agenda point of the volume. And that's both in terms of the themes, but also in terms of the contributors, of the authors. So one of the things that I wanted to do in terms of the people that I asked was, of course, to get specialists, brilliant writers, brilliant minds, but also people who specialise in particular areas and in particular texts. But likewise, to ask people everybody has a wide range in some ways, and something like epic. So to get some scholars to write on texts that they may not have published reams and reams on before. And that's where the thematic model, I think, I hope worked really well.
Could you say something about the accompanying web resource? Because I think that that's going to be something that really opens up these perhaps less familiar texts to a wider audience.
Yeah, so in terms of to facilitate this idea of letting these texts breathe, so letting Nonnus appear ex machina in a chapter alongside the Odyssey, but also taking seriously the fact that one should never presuppose too much knowledge, but to allow the hard-hitting, argument-driven, thematically centred chapters to do their work and not therefore have to use too much space, reminding or putting people in mind of what actually happens in these texts, which of course for the less familiar ones is a prerequisite. What I decided to do was to commission open access, freely available web page, which is going to go on the page of the companion, which has plot summaries of all of the epics which are discussed substantially within the volume, not the Iliad and the Odyssey, although maybe I should have done new summaries of those two, but every other text, so things like some texts that we've mentioned, like the Vision of Dorotheus, and other texts like Eudokius Kentos or Eudokius Martyrdom of St. Cyprian, which is a really interesting poem about a magician who converted. All these texts which feature in and across the chapters, there are substantial summaries which were written for the sole purpose of accompanying, or the initial purpose of accompanying this volume. And it was an interesting thing to do because pretty much, not all, but most of these texts, if you bunged their names into Google, you could get something. But in terms of the quality of what you'd get, it would vary. But having them all together and they're arranged chronologically. And I certainly did not write them all. I commissioned a lot of different people to write them, some grads, some postdocs, some of the authors who have worked on these texts for the companion and otherwise. So it was a really collaborative resource. And hopefully the double act of having the plots there, and one thing that I really tried to make sure the plots did, insofar as you can never separate these things out, is to actually just say what happened. Not so to let the analysis happen in the pages of the companion. So to do the what, and then let the chapters do the how and the why. So hopefully the idea of having those two things together should again contribute to this agenda, this ambition of having some of these currently increasingly, but still under read and appreciated works, putting them centre stage. We talked about this already, not stamping out or replacing Homer and Hesiod and co, who still, there are so many new insights that I think they still have to give with all these new approaches, but it's about having them all together. So hopefully that resource will do quite a lot of that heavy lifting.
Oh, and this will all be helped too by the compendium of translations of some of the later epics that I understand is in the works, or perhaps, Tim, you could give us a status update on that, because that is one of the, quote unquote outputs of the Greek Epic of the Roman Empire project.
It is, yeah. We, in the UK, to get a research project grant, you have to have impact. So one of the things that we promised was that we would produce new translations of these texts, which at the time seemed like a quite small little sort of add-on to the project, but it's turned into a massive thing. So Nonnis Dionysiaka is 1/3 of the whole thing. It's, as I say, such a big text. And that is now finished, we hope. And it's on its second read with the University of California Press, and I'm very hopeful that it will come out in 2025. It's been ongoing for years and years and years, and has caused my hair to go even grayer than it was before. There are two more volumes. One is mythological epic, and that includes Emma's people, Quintus, Tryphodorus, and the like, and the other is Christian and didactic material, and that will be volume 3. Volume 2 on the mythological one is largely complete. It needs a little bit of tidying up, but these volumes are so big that the press can only produce one per year, so they're going to come out at a relatively slow time. But hopefully the next 3 years we'll see the publication of all 3 volumes.
Well, this has been great. Thanks. I would ask you both, or I'd invite you to indulge me in a little game here. So I'm going to pose some words to you, and I would ask both of you, I guess I'll ask someone to start, and just tell me what first comes to mind. So, Emma, epic.
Volume.
Tim?
Fail.
Imperial Greek Epic. Emma?
Quintus.
Tim?
Classic.
Tim's going first, because he gets to think, he gets to plot, he gets to pause.
I know, I'm just about to switch it to him. So, Tim, now you're more on the spot. Nonus.
Exuberant.
Emma.
Monster.
All right. Tim, epic temporalities.
Vertiginous.
Emma.
Bendy.
And Emma will end with asking you to go first on Cambridge Companions.
Work.
And Tim, your thought?
Better than the rest.
All right. Well, a fitting end. Well, thank you both so much for this conversation. And Emma, congratulations on the volume. It's really a wonderful, remarkable accomplishment, I think, both in terms of just, getting the production process, getting such a volume out, but also in terms of this intellectual program and the very heavy lift of inspiring everyone to rethink what they associate with that word epic. So congratulations and thank you both.
Thank you so much. It's been really good fun.
Thank you, Janet.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesky Podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesky.